Today we're going to talk about red teaming at 10,000 feet, which is an article that I wrote sometime earlier this year or last year. My name is David Evenden, and I'm the owner and founder of Standard User Cyber. So let's just jump right in here and share here. So what we're going to jump right into and start sharing, talking about here again, it's a little bit more advanced of a conversation than our previous talks, but really focused on red teaming. So before we even start to step into even red teaming at 10,000 feet, let's talk about why it's called red teaming, where that comes from. So you might have, in the past, we've talked about like the idea of baselining or developing or even increasing your security posture. Sort of the top 10 cybersecurity fundamentals, and even like what a vCISO is, or advanced virtual CISO, when it comes to compliance and policy. Well, when you're dealing with all of those different aspects, one of the key fundamental aspects in there is, again, really implementing security positions to help with that process. So say, for instance, you might do testing, you might do security, or you might combine both of those together. The testing really is pen testing, vulnerability assessments, just doing some type of white hat hacking to help identify potential vulnerabilities. So when a team is developed in order to have a much larger scope, that would then become, a red team scope assessment against an environment, and the terminology there, you want to kind of go to NIST to make sure that you're locking down the specific terminology. But then blue team, which would be more like defensive capabilities, you'd sort of break into those defensive capabilities and identify how do you implement specific security controls in different environments. And so when both of those teams work together, that's when you end up having the overlay of a purple team. So moving down, and so really what we're going to talk about, instead of like kind of going into like really in-depth nitty-gritties, what type of tools and specifics like that, we're going to keep it pretty high level. So really, there's lots of material that talk about what a red team is, what is it made up of, or even, how it's broken into there. And really, when you have that red and that purple and that blue, we're really just talking about the red team portion of that today. And so really, when you have that, when you break it out into those portions, it might be, how does it operate? What is its function? What is it designed to do? Well, in this conversation, really what we're going to do is we're going to step back and say, how do you actually perform the steps of a red team? So you might start off with integrating, let's just say, for instance, you're a team that works with the organization, you're employed by the organization you're performing an assessment against. Let's just say your company name is company XYZ, you're an employee of XYZ, and you're a member of the red team of that company. So as you're a member of the red team of that company, now you're pushing and integrating back in to test there. There's a bunch of different examples, but you might be an MSP or an MSSP that's performing a red team assessment against a third-party company. Or you might just be an individual cybersecurity firm that's performing a red team assessment against a company. And so really, step one is, what am I testing? What do I have authorities to test? And how can I test those? What tools can I use? Who can I target? Are there off-limits lists? And so on and so forth. Those off-limits lists might be specific people. They might be pieces of infrastructure. They might be types of attacks, so on and so forth. All of that really built in is called the rules of engagement. You build out a proper rules of engagement. And then at that point, when you're moving forward, you should have minimal gaps in communication about what your expectations are and how the red team assessment should play out. So as a red team member, whether or not you're a team leader or manager, that's kind of what you should be focused on. Building out rules of engagement and then pushing back through. So if your rules of engagement entail utilizing specific types of methodologies within an organization, you should have people on your team that are trained within specific disciplines. Reconnaissance, targeting, exploitation or breach, persistence, migration or lateral movement, and data identification, data mining, and data exfiltration. So really, that's kind of the hacker methodology playbook, if you will, about what types of steps you're gonna perform. We went over these in the past, but we're gonna go ahead and go over them right now because you might just be joining in for the first time. So reconnaissance, really, or reconnaissance, is really OSINT, or open source intelligence. What information can you get from out on the internet? If this is your target, because I have a domain, I might have a company name, I may have a couple of people's usernames and what their roles or functions are. What information can I obtain about your organization that I can then turn around and use against you? So now you have a target. So targeting, most of the time you might think to yourself, targeting is like, okay, well, a target is the company. Well, target might be the target of the overall rules of engagement, but as you, I'm sorry, of the overall assessment, but as you break down and you start to identify specific targets, the target might be a person within that company. It might be a specific piece of infrastructure, a server, a firewall, an email security appliance, so on and so forth, whatever it might be, a VPN server. As you identify all of those different types of targets, then you begin to perform attacks. As you identify those targets, one of the key elements there is going to be ensuring that that target that you've identified that's potentially vulnerable is actually not in your off limits list. Because if you start to target and start to actually hack into pieces in your off limits list, then your credibility as a professional computer hacker kind of starts to go down. There's lots of talks and lots of conversations that go around about, well, in the real world, there's no such thing as an off limits list. Attackers will target anything. That's true. That's very true. The problem is that you have a responsibility to encourage and support and promote business continuity of the organization that you're working for or working with. So you still need to attempt to try to get another assessment done where you can test those infrastructure or ensure that they're patched properly, or so on and so forth. But really working with your organizations to ensure the highest standard of business continuity to support continued growth and uptime and so on and so forth is an important aspect of being a computer hacker and on a red team, on a red team or pen testing team or offensive security team of some kind. So so again, targeting and reconnaissance, that entire aspect of it, that's going to happen before you gain access, and it's going to happen after you gain access. As you move around and you look around once you're inside of an environment, you're going to need to do that again. So before we get there, let's just actually talk about gaining access or initial breach. That's throwing a specific exploit. And the difference between exploits and payloads, that's really not a key conversation for this topic, but it actually could be in future conversations, which we're scoping for. So, but in this capacity, what an exploit is, and throwing an exploit to gain access to a target machine, and then after you gain that access, installing specific types of persistence, and then looking at lateral movement and moving off of that machine. So what that means is as you gain initial access, that machine that you gain access to might not be your end target. You might be looking for some other type of piece of infrastructure or a person or intelligence or data or capabilities that don't exist or live on that target or victimized machine. That is your initial access. But it is a way into the environment. So you want to install persistence there. You want to move around to other machines, install different types of persistence. There are different stages, which I think we'll talk about. How many types of or key elements of persistence do you install in one environment? Really, that's proportional to the size of the environment and also what your scope and rules of engagement look like. So moving down, migration again is pivoting. You gain access to one machine, you want to pivot and move on to another one. You might not be able to gain access to those other machines via the internet. So pivoting really is, actually on my shirt, really is just gaining access to one machine and then moving from that machine into an internal machine without having that internal machine communicate with you to the internet. It's a little bit confusing, but the idea kind of is kind of like telephone. I want to pass one message to one person, I pass a message to them, they pass a message to someone else. That's pivoting. As long as instead of going in a direct line, that second person receives that message, gets an answer, sends it back to the person you told, and that person then tells you. That's essentially pivoting. So So data exfil, once you pivot enough times or move or migrate or lateral movement or whatever you want to call it to your actual end target, and you identify the key or element or data that you really want to steal or what your objective is, then that's where data exfiltration comes into play. So data exfiltration, stealing that information, obtaining that information for whatever use that you have it, kind of self-explanatory. So here, creating functional teams that fall within those specific categories is really important because one person might be able to do that work in that team, but you might need more than one person. One person might identify a specific target with a known vulnerability, but they don't know anything about Cold Fusion. So it's like, I don't know the vulnerability for this. I don't know how to exploit this. I don't know how to write in Cold Fusion. I don't know what to do. So if you have a well-rounded team with a couple of different individuals on there, within the different micro or tiger teams, that'd be a really helpful way to build out that environment. So so we have recon and targeting, which kind of discuss the same infrastructure. You might need specific types of teams, tool sets, and budgeting for different types of training, depending upon what's new and what the different resources are. But then we talk about interactive operations. So interactive operations really is kind of where that breach portion starts into play. As you gain access to an initial target, there's two different types of access. Well, there's probably a bunch of different types of access, but the two types we'll talk about are interactive operations and C2, let's just say, scheduled callbacks. So a scheduled automated callback calls back to a command and control server, C2, calls back to that server, gets whatever commands it's supposed to run, get those commands, send it back to the machine, so on and so forth. And once that machine runs them, it sends the results back to the C2 server and stores them so a person can come and look at it later. That's automated, that's untouched by a human. Interactive operations is hands-on keyboard. There's somebody sitting on a keyboard doing something and they're interactively operating against a victimized target. That's what IO means. So, that's what that looks like. Generally speaking, when persistence happens, that could be automated or that could be via interactive operations. So you could use different types of malware in order to perform those. You have worms and Trojans, all kinds of different types of activity. We do have another lane of videos called Conversations with Cliff that go into quite a bit more detail about what those different environments are. So, and then close access is another team that you might want to build out. That's if your goal or objective is to try to gain access to the building or gain access to some close access item, if you will, gain access, plug something in or browse and install something. And then a reporting team is actually going to be incredibly important because if you're not good at writing, like me, I would say I'm like in the top 50%, but definitely not above that 50%. I really need people to help me write functional and well-rounded reports that make sense to executive staff, management staff, and also peers in different environments. So ensuring that you have writers and technical writers and editors that can help you in your reporting is actually incredibly important. So developing effective scopes, that we kind of already discussed that within the rules of engagement, but really here, what we're talking about is actually the movement of what is your objective. So you might have a rules of engagement. How are you allowed to perform these tasks? What is your actual end goal? So, okay, in this environment, we deal with large financial transactions. I want you to go in and add your own financial transaction so you get paid $100,000 and nobody notices or sees it. Can you perform that action? That's your end target goal. That's what you're supposed to do. The rules of engagement it includes that line item, but it also includes everything else you're allowed to do in order to do that. So what are the means to the end that you're allowed to do? And so moving all the way throughout here is how you perform that action. So so that's kind of walking through all of those portions. As you kind of come back into here and what the rules of engagement are, one of that conversations within the red team, I'm sorry, that's the conversation of red teaming at 10,000 feet, how you would perform that specific type of scope. Remember ensuring that you're budgeting for training, budgeting for travel, on-site travel, tool sets, that entire aspect. Those are going to be an important part of red teaming at 10,000 feet. When you actually start to break into that purple teaming is sort of here in this image, where then you're sort of talking about how do I implement or overlay blue team or defensive methodologies in that. So I might have recon, target, breach, persistence, migration, and exfiltration. And then in reverse, what is the end goal, financial transaction, end goal? Okay, that's your identified critical data. How do I prevent people who don't have authorization to get to that? How do I prevent them from getting to that? Or, who has access to this? Where's it at? Who can see it? And what can they do with that information? So identifying critical data, decreasing network migration or increasing network visibility, the host visibility upon initial breach, perimeter visibility, what can be targeted, what can be accessed. Do I have web application firewalls, specific type of security firewalls for people to block and to be blocking automated attacks or even individual targeted attacks, email security appliances, and so on and so forth. And then performing your own, whether or not you're paying somebody to do some type of OSINT scanning for you, deep web, dark web, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, ensuring that you're scanning that for any type of compromised credentials, doing your own reconnaissance of your own company to see, do I have any people out there talking about critical data that they really shouldn't be discussing. So doing that in type of research, and then putting all of the information back together to make a higher level risk determination on what does your risk look like. So that's sort of the conversation of red teaming at 10,000 feet. I know we kind of moved through that pretty quickly, but that really sort of puts in a lot of the scope and information to help you understand what is a red team, what is the functional goals of a red team, how to build a red team, what makes up the different targeting, or what makes up the different shops of a red team, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's sort of a short day, but I appreciate it, and you guys have a great weekend.